the space for civil society, expression, dissent, all that have been really a challenging space for all of us. And it is in this context that we are coming together. So I really look forward to this as an open discussion where we can really take stock of what are some of these large government processes and how do we as civil society perceive them and how do we respond or engage with them to really enhance people's power and enhance civil society engagement. But to give a very brief background of this coming together, I'm extremely happy that Anselmo is really very instrumental in bringing many of these government and civic forums. And it was his idea that we need a larger and more deeper engagement between G7, G20, BRICS, and various other collaborative forums, including the World Social Forum, where many of us have been together in Bangkok. And it is also my very conviction that in these times we need to enhance and collaborate people's spaces much more wherever we can, because I think that is really the space for us to move forward. Very briefly, People's 20 is a new initiative. The need came up when India took the presidency of G20. And unlike tradition, or even unlike the regular space available to civil societies or civil spaces, almost every engagement group of the G20 is captured by the state and its agents. The traditional, the human rights organizations, the development organizations have found very little space within those engagement bodies to either articulate or to bring up the concerns of common people. So it was then that people who've been part of the Bali discussions, people who've been part of G20 and G7 processes over a long period of time, we felt that we should be able to continue and protect the space and take it forward in a continuous dialogue, moving it forward to the next countries. And the whole idea of People's 20 was initiated. Initially, we thought it may be just a civil society space that we need to support and strengthen. But what we realize is there has been a recent communication from the international trade unions to say that they don't agree to the L20 processes. We see a lot of, other spaces being oriented towards a majoritarian perspectives of human values, a lot of rhetoric being talked about in many ways, but really without reaching down to the purpose of G20 and what it can do for communities. So the People's 20 has now become beyond a civic space, but want to engage with other engagement groups too, like the youth dimension, the labor dimension, other dimensions of the G20. And we feel that it is a space we need to keep as a voice for communities and people. So the primary engagement has been to have a coordinate conveners group of 6 people, plus an advisory group of 15 people. This is not really limited only to India, but global civil society organizations, think tanks, and other expert members. And we have also, in keeping with the continuity of the G20 process, identified about 10, 11 thematic areas and 2 to 3 task groups that again are international in its nature, and policy documents are drafted, vetted by advisory group members. And this is being finalized so that we can present this to the G20 leadership within the G20 countries, both in India and also outside. So I think while this being a very focused intervention of the People's 20, which would be having its People's Assembly in Delhi on the 27th and 28th, I'd like to welcome anyone who's able to come this side. We hope you'll be able to join us for the People's Assembly process. But while People's 20 is a specific process, we also recognize the need for collaborating with other civic spaces, whether it's BRICS or G7 or any POP or anything else. And so this becomes really a very valuable space for us to continue this engagement. I would like to really thank all the coordinators for putting this together and for the presentations that we've been shared with, and look forward to this discussion to really see how in this critical time we can take forward the civic space and strengthen the civil society collaboration. Welcome to each one of you, particularly the people who will be discussing the two presentations that we have. I must say that they went beyond my head quite a bit. So I look forward to the discussions and the light that the discussants will throw upon these two presentations. Thank you so much and welcome again. Thank you, Anselmo. Anselmo, you're muted. Anselmo, you're muted. Rajini, you may have to unmute Anselmo. Is that so?
Yeah, I am so sorry. Okay, thank you very much, Annie, for your warm welcome and also introduction about People's 20 and its background, which I think is very important to be shared among all the participants. Now, I'd like to invite Farouk Tariq to give us also welcome on behalf of Asia-Europe People's Forum. You can find their background in the chat box, to save time. Farouk, you have 3 to 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you, Anselmo, for organizing this important event. And thank you, Aniji. You have given a great start presenting all the different aspects of this meeting and also why we are together and what should we be doing in future and about the meetings and also the People's Assembly in Delhi and so on. Thank you for all the details which you have mentioned already. So on behalf of Asia-Europe People's Forum, I welcome all the participants, speakers, presenters, and those who would be listening to this recording in future as well. This is an important event because we are going through a very difficult period of history. It is a period where right-wing forces are on the offense, where they are taking over the space which was available for the progressive forces. They are taking away our democratic human rights, economic rights. They are trying their best to implement the new liberal agenda, which is really making people more poor, inequality on the rise. So we see that the right-wing governments, particularly in G20, when they are getting together in India, we don't see any hope from the gathering of these heads of the state. So we have to have an alternate platform. And the alternate platform which was available, C20, has been also captured by the agents of Indian government. And these are like taking over of the civic space by those who are using religion in the civic sphere. So we have to organize this People's 20. I was really happy and honored to be at the meeting in Bangkok and where we discuss all different aspects. And I look forward, although Pakistan is not part of G20, but we still look forward about the outcome of People's 20. And also we'll see and try to intervene and try to regain the space we have lost at C20. So we will try to present our views, wherever, whenever, and and whatever is possible, we'll do our best. We don't want to be disengaged on the processes. We want to be engaged, but we are pushed out of it. And the P20 is a space where all these different civil society organization, which are very credible organization, which has been there for years and years. When no one was talking about human rights, about democratic rights, these organizations were there. So we don't want to be just pushed away. So we have created our own space, and I thank you, Anselmo, and particularly our Indian friends of the civil society who took the brave initiative. And they still, I am totally on their side, and we all express our solidarity with our Indian friends who dare to organize this assembly in Delhi. All the best, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Farooq, again for joining us. And also, I would like to convey apologies and also welcome from Tina from Philippines. She's a Asia coordinator HLPF. She had some family challenges. That's why she is not able to join us today. So now, without further ado, let me present to you. As you see in the chat box, there are 3 guiding questions for panelists. We want to make this, instead of a long presentation, we want to make it really as interactive possible. That's why I prepared the guiding questions. So I will present the first question to all the panelists. They can use 2-3 minutes each question. The first question is, what are the emerging geopolitical challenges from G7, G20, BRICS summits in terms of global CSO advocacy for peace, justice, equality? As you know, we had the G7 summit last month in Hiroshima, and also there will be a BRICS summit in August, supposed to be South Africa, and also G20 summit in India. So these are the 3 geopolitical summit, not geographical one. And civil society has been engaged separately without being connected. That's why we want to bring 3 geopolitical summits together to see how we can collaborate, how we can address those challenges more integrated manner. So that's why we put this question, the emerging challenges from these 3 summits. As you see in the program, we have the speakers from Asia and Europe, especially the Europe play a key role in G7. That's why we organize this one, People 20, and also AEPF, Asia Europe People's Forum. So now, according to program, let me invite one by one. First, while I am inviting the panelists, I will put their background in the chat box so that you can see what kind of background they have. And in order to save time, so let me invite first Vidya from India. She's also one of the co-conveners of People's 20. Vidya, could you please respond to the first question? And also you can also introduce briefly yourself. Vidya? Yeah, please.
Thank you, Anselmo. Thank you. Here I am living in India in the kind of conditions that Annie and Farooq brought to you very vividly. And I think, yes, so as Anselmo said, I'm supposed to introduce myself. So an Indian citizen living in South India in coastal Karnataka. And I happen to be the president of the Indian Social Action Forum, which has members across many, many states of India. And I coordinate a small all-woman team called Growth Watch, which is an action research kind of group together with Rajni and others here. You know, when it comes to why should someone like me, who looks even at herself as a kind of street fighter, you know, not somebody who is lobbying with the powers that be and trying to influence policy on a daily basis. That is not my primary engagement in my civic engagement. Why should somebody like me bother? I think Farooq mentioned it, that we were very concerned generally, yes, there's no hope in the G20, as he said, and now, of course, in the C20, as he mentioned. And we thought that there are alternative platforms that some CSOs who want to be in that space, kowtow with powerful powerful countries and their representatives, usually suited and booted in air-conditioned rooms. And we thought that the Civil 20, the W20, the Labor 20, and all these various engagement groups of the G20 can just handle it. This time, with the G20 being hosted by India, and we see the kind of fanfare that the Indian government has brought along with it, and as if they are the chosen ones to host the G20. That's when we said it's election year next year, and clearly the Indian government is priming for that election, calling itself the mother of democracy. And we know how it plays out on the ground for civil society actors or just ordinary people. And we thought we cannot just walk away from this challenge, and we need to be part of a more inclusive alternative platform, because let's face it, the geopolitics of Asia at the moment means that China especially is the one that everyone in Europe and in the US is very nervous about. And who do they have as the counter in the region? It's India. And therefore, nobody will challenge our present government and the way they are conducting themselves. They will not, the West, who we think can ask those difficult questions of our government, will not. So it really rests with us, the permanent opposition, the permanent people who hold their governments accountable to step up and do what is needed at this time. One, show the Indian government what are the most important issues for the people, push towards a more equal society, a more just society, but also sort of call out the other governments in the way that they are quiet on excesses of our own governments or others, in all spheres. So it's not just, for example, state excess when it comes to somebody trying to protect their homes or their environment or their livelihoods, but really the growing inequity, which is really excessive. We've seen it through the pandemic. The question of the war, the pandemic, for the first time, I think about 80, 90 countries are coming out on the street where people are really crying out against their governments in action on the important things of the day. And therefore, whether it's the G7, whether it's the G20, whether it's the BRICS, and the People's 20 wants to be the people's voice, and beyond the people's voice in only G20 countries, but in non-G20 countries, because let's face it, G20 countries' policies, especially economic policies and the way they conduct themselves, influences the whole world. And so we have LDC countries and other non-G20 countries as part of the People's 20, and we hope to be a good opposition on the ground that's talking the real issues and taking them to the powers that be. Okay, that's my kickstart, and I hope my other panelists will take it further, push the ball.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for very good opening remark. As a citizen of the host country G20, a lot of the challenges within India. Of course, G20 also the global event. I don't know whether you all remember the PowerPoint and presented by Jomo. He said in his presentation, of course, the role of G7, G20 has changing, but because of war in Ukraine and also BRICS also emerging as another geopolitical power. And one of the key points he made was, instead of G7 and G20 accountable UN, this group, they are undermining UN agenda. At the same time, today, G20 is accountable G7. He was very critical of G7, at the same time G20, you know. So I think I want to remind you his presentation. How do you see the power dynamics among the three, you know? As you know, the last week, France, Saudi Arabia already announced they want to join BRICS, and also even France as a G7 country wants to join BRICS. It's very confusing, you know, what kind of power dynamics going on today, you know, among G7 and then G20 and the BRICS, you know. So that's why I think the role of India is very important. India is a member of BRICS at the same G20 and the host, and also many. So that's why I hope to hear more from our Indian civil society friends, how you understand this changing dynamics. So now, without further ado, let me invite the panelist, Sharmali Gutta from Focus on the Global South. You have also a few minutes. Sharmali, please.
Thank you, Anselmo. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, yes, okay.
And you can see me? Okay, all right. So I'm Sharmali Gutta. I'm with Focus on the Global South. I'm also from India, and I'm right now in India, just a little bit north of Vidya, also on the coast. But, okay. So let me go directly into some notes I made about the emerging challenges, the geopolitical challenges. Now, I'll start by reminding us that the G7, G20, and the BRICS, they are in varying degrees self-appointed groupings of countries that have come together to pursue particular political economic interests. They're not elected or appointed by any international body or by any people, nor do they answer to anyone but themselves. And I think this is a very important point to remember. They are a club made by themselves for themselves. But what they have done is they've taken charge of global economic and political governance in such a way that the multilateral system of the United Nations, the system of one country, one vote, and also the international human rights architecture that is supposed to provide the basis of this multilateralism, both have been significantly weakened.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the G7, you know, is the club with most, shall we say, heft. They have the most muscle. This is the original gang of colonial nations who maintain and expand their global power after the so-called era of decolonization through the control of development aid and financing, trade, investment, financial rules, you know, deciding what is a security issue, what is not, and so on. Now, this control is exercised through their bilateral and plurilateral relationships with different countries, but more importantly, through the control of global institutions, such as the multilateral development banks, the international financial institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, which include the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, which is often called the third leg of the Bretton Woods institutions, the Bank of International Settlements, and so on. Now, these institutions and this power, economic power that G7 wields in these institutions, they enable Western capital and transnational corporations to expand, to extract resources, and to concentrate markets power globally. So the economic mantra is free market, but the result actually is oligopolies. You know, it's really strong market concentration, and this is one of the big hallmarks of the G7. Now, decision-making in these institutions of global economic governance that I just mentioned, these are weighted in terms of in the favor of nations with money. So this is G7 and OECD countries. Of course, China has sway in some of these institutions, but you know, the US has tried to curtail China's power because of its own economic and strategic war games with China, and also its attempt to maintain global hegemony, at least in name, even if in material conditions, the US is really not much of an economic power at all to reckon with, you know? So of course, India is, as Vidya already pointed out, is a very important, shall we say, jewel in the crown of all these Gs, because India can be, you know, put into the ring as a bulwark against China. Now, the G20 is an invention of the G7 to neutralize dissatisfaction among developing countries about the domination of global economic governance by a handful of wealthy countries. So by getting some large developing countries or emerging economies to join the club, this is a co-optation strategy that has been very effective. So basically, we have seen that the developing countries, emerging economies in G20 have not showed the independence needed to shift the course of global economic and political governance. And this is a huge challenge. Now, if we look at BRICS, BRICS is actually inconsequential in terms of alternative governance. It's more an opportunistic alliance for investment and basically to show the world that the countries of the South have raw materials, markets, consumers, so they should be taken seriously by wealthy countries. If we look at all BRICS members, they have neoliberal economies. They have not challenged the financial institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions. They've not even made a dent or input into the United Nations Security Council with all the wars and the conflicts going on. I'm not talking just about Ukraine. I'm talking about what's happened in North Africa, what's happened in Myanmar, the continuing occupation of Palestine, and so on. So, you know, what can we expect from these regimes in terms of South-South solidarity? I think it's a very big question. Maybe Brazil can make a difference now, but let's see. Now, in terms of just a few more points I'd like to raise, I won't talk about the issues of peace and equality and climate change, because I know there are many other colleagues on this panel who will discuss them. But two challenges I want to flag, additional challenges from what I said. One is the issue of the global debt crisis, which is a very serious issue. And the G7 and G20 have completely failed in addressing this. And despite advance warnings and historical precedents, because this is not the first time we've had a third world debt crisis. Let's not forget the period from the 80s and 90s and structural adjustment and austerity policies and so on. So despite all these precedents, there are no workable strategies and plans on the table for resolving the debt crisis or for preventing its recurrence. If we look at the so-called common framework that was devised by the G20, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, it's grossly inadequate. The Western financial powers are blaming China as the problem. And this has little basis, in fact, because China has lots of other issues, but actually on the issue of debt cancellation and debt forgiveness, it's been pretty good, especially for poor countries in Africa. And an important reason behind the China blame game is that China did not agree to join the Paris Club of Creditors, which is dominated by the G7. And it did refuse to impose those conditionalities that the Paris Club of Creditors and the IMF want to impose on, countries that act, like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and other smaller countries in size that, that are going through that crisis. Now, of course, China has pointed out that it refuses to impose these conditionalities because it has not worked in the past. But this has become a sort of a China blame game. Now, I'm not saying China is innocent, and as is very evident, China is also after raw materials, natural resources, and markets, which we can see in the BRICS and the New Development Bank and the Asia Infrastructure Bank. These drive its investment strategies and bilateral relationships with many countries of the South. But in this particular case, China cannot be accused of debt trap diplomacy. This is a G7, G20, Bretton Woods financial institutions problem. They have created the problem and they've got no solution out for it, and they will continue to create this problem. Another big issue, of course, of the debt crisis is complicated by the fact that many debts are owed to private creditors, especially investors that have bought sovereign bonds, that is government bonds. And I won't go into the details here, but this is definitely a result of the kinds of economic and financial policies that G7 countries themselves put in place, and that the IMF, as one of the, the muscle institutions of the G7, has pushed on to indebted countries. The second point, the last point I want to make here is, which is a very big challenge that is emerging from the kind of financial and economic governance that the G7, and then by extension, the G20 has been pushing, is the growing power of corporations. Most of these corporations have their basis in wealthy countries, G7 countries, now G20 countries, some of them, but mostly G7. And they are not only increasing their power in the world economy, but they're also increasing their power in global governance, which again, undermining multilateralism. Earlier we had a notion of multilateralism where states in the UN make decisions on behalf of their people. They're supposed to be accountable to their people. They're supposed to regulate the economy in the public interest. All these is being set aside in the name of what's called networked multilateralism, which is a multi-stakeholder model of global governance that's being promoted by the United Nations itself, by the United Nations Secretary General. And it gives corporate and industry bodies, seats at regional and global decision-making tables, which is a very dangerous thing. Now, the World Economic Forum has become established as a parallel forum for addressing the problems and crises of the world. And this is where the world's wealthiest people meet every year. The World Economic Forum leadership has been pushing the model of what they call stakeholder capitalism and multi-stakeholderism as sort of political economic models of governance. Now, the WEF has a strategic partnership with the United Nations. And, this has already played itself out in the United Nations Food System Summit, which is sort of what many of us call a corporatocracy, as sort of an international bureaucracy made up of corporate actors, which include not just corporations, but also philanthropies, corporate philanthropies, business councils, so-called expert groups, and many international NGOs that are funded by corporations. No? So why am I bringing this point up is because the problems with these kinds of parallel forums that are put up is that there is no accountability. They are operating on the G7 principle, and they're operating on the G7 model. It's basically capital rules. It's more than $1, 1 vote, or €1, 1 vote. So there is no accountability of decisions taken in these fora back to an international body or back to the people of those countries. And this is one of the reasons why I agree very strongly and echo what Jomo has cautioned, that multilateralism is being attacked in very particular ways by a corporatocracy and an oligopoly of economic and financial actors. So I'll leave it here, Anselmo, and then come back later. I'm sure my other friends and colleagues on the panel will add to the other challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamali, for very good articulation about the key challenges, especially the economic side. As you rightly said, this G20, G7 is not legitimate. It's own choice. But that's why there's a lot of discussion among the civil society organizations whether to engage, this illegitimate body, or this still some group are against, but those who join the People's 20, but nevertheless we need to engage, and because whether it's an illegitimate one, it's influential. They are making decisions. Their decisions are affecting people on the ground, especially the global south. That's why we decide to engage critical manner with bring the voice. At the same time, challenging the legitimacy of this the G7 and G20 as well, And also, you mentioned about a World Economic Forum. I see some friends from the World Social Forum, especially Asia Pacific Social Forum. As you know, there will be a World Social Forum Kathmandu, February next year. So this will be also another important opportunity. Although it is outside the intergovernmental process, I think we need to be linked to this our own autonomous civil society or social movement process. I hope we can discuss later on the guiding question 2 or 3 when you discuss our own strategies. So let's continue. So from India, Global South, we go to only Asian country, which is a member of the G7 and G20. So now we have the Masaki Inaba. He has been working so long for this G7 as a C7 members and also Japan Africa Forum. Masaki, you have a floor. Please share your perspective.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I have been working for G7, working on G7 for a long time. In 1993, I was a university student, and I led the demonstration against the G7 Tokyo Summit. Very much militant demonstration. Such kind of demonstration in Japan, currently there are no, have never organized. But anyway, so after that, I have been working on the, especially on advocacy and also somewhat lobbying on the G7 as an advocate on the development finance and also development issues, especially the health issues. The question was that what are the emerging geopolitical challenges from G7, G20, and the BRICS summits in terms of the global CSO advocacy for peace, justice, and equality? And as you know, that in the context of the G7, the tendency of the new Cold War between what they say bloc of democracies, it means the G7. It is very much self-claimed, and also the bloc of authoritarians. It shows that how say that the G7 says that for example Russia and China are in the bloc of the authoritarians, and these kind of two blocks are there, and it has been this kind of rhetoric has been dominating in the G7. How say the G7 statement. The official statement in the G7 communique, they are hesitant to use such words and choose more moderate words such as de-risking and diversifying when they mention about their policy of withdrawal from the China. But it is apparent that they recognize that the world has been split again, and they are in the one side and the others are in the other side. So this tendency influences everything, especially including the current global negotiation on pandemic preparedness, what I have been working on. The G7 recognizes that technology transfer, sharing of pandemic medical countermeasures, and the strengthening of manufacturing capacity is necessary to prevent next pandemic. But they insist that these efforts should be based on voluntary cooperation from Western pharmaceutical industries. They always exclude mandatory measures, even the technologies are developed by huge public money investment. The new Cold War is one of the background of their strict intellectual property rights protection policy in multilateral pandemic preparedness negotiation that is ongoing now. They don't want to share this technology with their potential enemies. But it is also interesting that they are not the one group. G7 is not the one group. UK's 100 days mission of G7, which was issued by the Boris Johnson in 2021, and whose purpose is to capacitate G7 to develop MCMs, medical countermeasures, within 100 days mission, 100 days from the day pandemic start. But now it becomes an Anglo-Saxon initiative. The UK and the US and Japan has been eagerly working on this 100 days mission, but other G7 countries in EU like Germany, France, Italy, these kind of countries ignore or somewhat oppose the initiative. It is quite interesting that there are divisions inside the G7, especially between US, UK, Japan, and the rest of the G7. So that anyway, such kind of split has been there and still inside the G7, so that somewhat it is very much interesting when the world has been, how say, the G7 has been splitting the world from the to the how say the as a kind of new Cold War. But anyway, G7 also split how say in the competitive situation how say competitive situation between these kind of Anglo-Saxon countries and also EU countries. It is very much interesting thing. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, the Masaki. Especially the health issues. There's also a lot of the politics around this vaccine and this pandemic issues. So let's continue. So now let's go to Europe now. We have the Valeria Emi from GCAP Italy. As you know, this year G7 summit was held in Japan, but next year G7 will be in Italy. So Italy will play a very important role. So Valeria, you have the floor, please.
Thanks a lot, Anselmo, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to see many of you, and thanks a lot also for this invitation and for organizing this event exchange and webinar on the G7, G20, and BRICS. As you mentioned, I'm representing here Italian civil society organization under the chapeau of GICA Italy, Global Call to Action Against Poverty, which is the key interlocutor for Italian institutions on G7 and G20 processes, and also the 2030 agenda implementation, and expression maybe of the one of the largest global CSO movement within the 2030 agenda framework. I'm also a member of the Civil 7 Steering Committee, and as you mentioned, Anselmo, we are preparing our advocacy action around the next Italian presidency of the G7. We had recently the Italian presidency of the G20 as well in 2021, and I've been appointed at that time as a sous Sherpa of the Civil 20. So I'm here with an extensive experience also in this fora from the civil society organization's perspective. In terms of geopolitical challenges, actually the speakers who preceded me already mentioned the main elements. I would like just to emphasize the fact that we are actually facing globally a kind of unprecedented world resulting exactly from multiple crises, multi-layered crises with a dramatic impacts that are magnifying critical, structural, and systemic challenges that have been unaddressed for far too long. So we are facing this. Global multi-layered crises, which are triggering a kind of global permanent state of crisis, rooted in structural inequalities, fragilities, and vulnerabilities. And we are aware of the fact that these impacts are generating poverty, are generating hunger and food insecurity, are generating environmental degradation with extreme weather events, a magnification of inequalities at all levels, but also gender inequalities, economic and political instability. So this permanent state of crisis we are facing currently is exacerbating pre-existing inequalities and exposing the systemic failures of the global order. So this is key because to respond to global challenges, we need a common resolve, we need bold initiatives in scale and scope, and a systemic revision as well of the narrative for action and the political approach. And we need also to combine urgent short-term responses commensurate to the scale of the crisis with structural systemic reforms. So as I mentioned, the global challenges require common results, which means also strong international solidarity. Which means a determination to leave no one behind, which means also centrality of human rights and UN-centered multilateral process to advance on the pathways towards sustainability, exactly to address systemic issues. So the unbearable restrictions on policy, fiscal and judicial space of developing countries with policy space limited by unfair trade, lack of fiscal resources, also due illicit financial flows and unsustainable debt burdens, which means, for instance, that low and especially middle-income countries don't have the adequate fiscal space to confront their critical development challenges. The volatility and variability of financing strategies based on private investors, also due to prevailing orientation of national and regional economic systems favoring export-oriented strategies. And we have seen the war in Ukraine as it's triggering a problem in terms of exportations, which means also hunger, which means problem in terms of energetic resources, with proper assessment of social and environmental impact of global competition regimes, and also the prevalence of national and nationalistic responses driven by my country first approach, affecting resource allocation and distribution chains. The consistency and inadequacy of the mainstream policy orientation, with the fragmentation of responses and with the resurgence of national interest over international cooperation. So in this global crisis, the role of the G7, G20 and BRICS needs to be firmly located in this understanding, the understanding that the multi-layered crisis need to be tackled at global level, in the scope and scale, and that are urgently required with a long-term perspective. So we have already learned how the G20, for instance, is changing, has been changing its role over the years by expanding to the other critical global policy concerns. The G7 is reinvigorating its role. The BRICS, it's actually collectively still unclear. So our understanding of this expansion and this role of such an informal fora, such as the G7, G20, even BRICS, should neither replace nor displace the global consensus within the UN, but should rather support it with its leadership, with policy action within countries, G7, G20, BRICS countries, and strengthen resources commitments at home and international. So we need to recognize that informal fora, such as the G7, G20, and BRICS, can play a useful role in increasing understanding among countries and build consensus on accelerating the action needed to advance the agenda for sustainable development and prevent the multi-layered crisis from reaching catastrophic levels. So in this case, actually the challenges we are facing as a civil society organization is the fact that the proper space of our interaction is shrinking. So our interconnection and interdependency are so profound that you need strong institutions at global level if you want to be able to govern the processes. Otherwise, the alternative is a world dominated by relations of power that will inevitably enhance differences and conflict with solutions that are solved with power and domination. But the threats to dialogue and the corresponding growing degree of violence is critical element. We see it in many examples, from the shrinking civil space to the criminalization and stigmatization of human rights defenders, from gender-based violence and verbal violence, physical abuses, and the armed conflicts. So refusing dialogue quickly becomes a legitimation of the violence. So global sustainable development cannot be pursued if all of the social actors are fully engaged and involved and protagonists of this process. By involving more the right holders, those without a voice clearly audible, those who are suffering most of the current crisis. That's why, in terms of which kind of strategies and advocacy strategies we can push and adopt.
Valeria, we can speak about strategy next question. So we can speak next question, okay?
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much, Valeria. I'm sure you are, being in Europe, you are more affected by the war in Ukraine, you know, as you said, you know, this is a big challenge. Now, there's also a lot of spillover effect in Asia, all over the world. So we will discuss more. I put also a question, the chat box, you know, there's a multiple global crisis, which are all interconnected, you know. Of course, war in Ukraine, and also food and energy crisis, and, you know, the hegemonic rivalry between the US and China, now with the Russia and climate. These are all, you know, global. How the effect is the power dynamics, you know, within Europe. That's why, as I mentioned in the beginning, I was so surprised, you know, the France wants to join the BRICS, and BRICS was not functioning well in the past, but now BRICS is emerging as another very geopolitical power bloc within G20. As you know, G20 is composed of traditionally G7 and BRICS and the rest, you know. So, but as you know, the civil society has been engaging in the name of C7 and C20, but not regularly the BRICS. We used to, so this is also another challenge for us, how to be connected with the civil society in BRICS countries, so that we can have a solid, you know, the common position on those challenges. So we will discuss more in the next question. So anyway, so we have three more panelists to speak about the first question. Let's go to the now UK. We have two speakers from UK, and Sandra Martinsone from Bond. Bond is a national platform of the CSO in UK. Sandra, you have a floor, please.
Thank you very much. So my name is Sandra. I'm working for Bond, and I'm leading a work on sustainable economic development issues, and have been working on G7 agenda for the last 3 years, I think now. So I wanted to focus on three things really here. So first of all, kind of just general maybe reflection on the recent summits, and kind of like, you know, where all these summits are taking us, you know. And maybe that will be also, you know, a bit of reflection kind of from the UK specific side as well. So I think there's this wealth of really you know, commitments made on everything and anything, and I think there's really a difficulty, I think, to really treat them seriously. I think I personally feel like we're getting to the point, because they're made without really you know, accountability attached. You know, we know that if you look back to, you know, last communiques for the last, let's say, 5 years, you would find so many commitments made, but they are not followed. And you know, we can go really, you know, historically. So what's really the value of the language we managed actually to get in those communiques? So that's really one big challenge, because to some extent this is kind of how we measure, you know, if you are successful, if you get a specific asks or, you know, language in there. But I think there's problem with the commitments. And so the other thing I want to emphasize here is then also kind of like cognitive dissonance in a way, and with that one, you know, what I mean is, so in a way, you know, there would be the agreement, you know, all these challenges and what needs to be done, but it's complete you know, opposite of what's actually happening in action, and I find it really disturbing, and I think that's is across the board, I think, and you know, really also critically assessing the UK's policies is really, it comes quite strongly. I think the other really observation is also, I think, the really lack of urgency, or definitely detachment, you know, really from the real impact of these global challenges, and therefore, I guess, inability to see how urgent the action is really needed. You know, if the UK or like let's say the Western world as such, you know, is not in the middle of the kind of the floods as the Pakistani people are, or you know, facing really dramatic now impacts which we see, you know, in all corners of the world. I think that, yeah, it's that the political mobilization and political will is not coming close, and we know that COVID showed, right, when it really hits your home, we can act, right, and I think that's the kind. It just shows it's not there. And Ukraine obviously is showing as well, right, that how we can respond to Ukraine, which is closer to home, and it's more directly maybe hitting various interests, including obviously the you know, financial interest. We can again mobilize and find billions, you know, for things, and for other things we can't. And the last one on this one is, I think that a really very big important one is about especially going forward, is the climate is quite Euro-Western centric, you know. Economic security as a term, or insecurity as a term, to me is really as a path to really looking at what's in our interest, what works best for the West, rather than how seeing this as we are really, you know, somebody used this metaphor that we are actually on the plane in air, and like it doesn't matter if you sit in a first class or in a second class, if the plane is falling, everyone is falling and dying, right? And I think we are not getting that kind of understanding of where we are. And the last thing on reflection is also, I think there's not really fully that realization of historic injustices, and you know, a lot of the things what we are talking about for the low-income countries, middle-income countries, it's really the impact of the various things happening in the past, and lack of that recognition, and therefore a willingness to correct those things is also just something is still not happening. So when it comes to, you know, your three questions you posed for us to reflect on. So the second was about the engagement, and here I wanted to reflect as well. So I think there is what I observe. I think there is a bit of the capacity issue, to be honest, and prioritization. You know, in Afghanistan, and again, I can speak really about the UK, for example, is in this space as well, about really engaging with this G7 space, and also I would say the kind of fragmentation as well. I think there is not necessarily I found often, and maybe too often, diversity views is fine, but I think when it comes to really influencing, that diversity is not helping, you know. And I was also talking recently to our UK G7 Sherpa team, when they were actually talking of, you know, from their perspective, you know, like if there are several people, you know, from civil society or even engagement groups coming with slightly different messages, it's confusing, and you know, they're also usually short-staffed, so it's not helping. And I think it's not also helping for us as a force, and really as a united voice. So something maybe really to think about, and think how we can improve in next engagements. And I think there's also something about maybe more like elephant in a room as well. There's something about the global south, global north. You know, if you use this kind of a very simplified split, but how unified we are in our policy and advocacy. You know, what we really think are the key things, and how progressive, how radical we are. I think that is also, again, I think is influencing what we can achieve. And then just going forward, I think
Sandra.
Yes?
You can, you have another chance to speak about, you know, challenges, strategies about CSO. Okay. So let's save some for next question. All right. Okay. Thank you very much, Sandra. So let's go to the next the panelist, Andy, and then look forward. He's from UK, but he experienced much more than UK, you know, Europe and Asia. So we'll be happy to hear your voice and also perspective. Andy, you have a floor, please.
Thank you so much, Anselmo. It's a privilege to be part of this discussion. Yes, and as you say, I'm based in the UK, but my spirit is part of the Asia-Europe People's Forum, and I've been involved in the International Organizing Committee since 1996. And just a minor reflection, at that time, there were many social movements and groups who have been what was called at the time chasing summits. They were quickly trying to get their position, their line for the next UN summit. And organizations, networks, people's movements such as the APF are a response to that strategically rather negative and imperfect and disempowering approach. And so I think the spirit of the discussion here is how can we develop collective and commonly owned and agreed positions which can be shared across regions, across social movements, to have a voice of the people and various peoples as part of this process. Your question one, what are the emerging geopolitical challenges? I'll be quite blunt here because people have spoken a lot about some of the detail already. The main challenge is that the G7, G20, BRICS, etc., they're basically doing a number of things which we don't want them to do. First, they're avoiding the realities of the climate crisis, and they're avoiding the obvious, clearly stated, clearly agreed, and clearly potentially important necessary responses. So that avoidance, that criminal avoidance, is something which is at the heart of their inactions, but also at the heart of their contradictions. Secondly, as Shamali has so clearly and brilliantly shared, they are vehicles, they're forums, they're spaces and places which have been progressively captured and influenced by the multilateral-led neoglobal approach. And this has, in this phase, it itself is fighting for its survival. It is exploding with contradictions. It is totally unclear on how to deal with them. So the net result within these fora is that these contradictions lead and feed yet more inaction. The last sort of trend is that these fora in different ways have been increasingly, they always have been, but they've increasingly become the arenas for playing out the geopolitical ambitions, agendas, aspirations of the so-called larger powers in the world today, and their political economic preferences and challenge that they're trying to encourage others to be to adhere to be part of their worldview. The word which is always disturbing in this is the word group, because in the end, the theatre, that they're there as a group theatre, but in practice, the contradictions are overriding any group sentiments. So to summarize the challenges, if we, as your question asks us to do, Anselmo, well, we're very lucky that the Asia-Europe People Forum embarked on this in-depth discussion in face-to-face meetings and discussions. And we've come up with the 3 interlinked challenges. And quite simply, they are: number 1, the climate crisis and biodiversity loss, which is an absolute given challenge. It's not an emerging geopolitical challenge, it is the challenge. Secondly, and it's more than an elephant in the room, it's a lived reality for everyone in the call today, is growing authoritarianism and discrimination. Yeah, and this is expressing itself in all the ways which infuse and inspire our day-to-day struggles and work. And we can list all the consequences of that, but that will be telling you all what you experience on a day-to-day basis. But we have, in the Asia-Europe People's Forum, worked through this in great detail. And then thirdly, is quite simply within the global agendas, the challenges that they're focusing on, the lack of social justice, and as a result, the growing inequalities between peoples, between countries, between women and men, between classes, between different ethnic groups, and many more. So these three fundamental challenges are the fundamental geopolitical challenges of the G7, of the G20, of the BRICS, and of all of us. But, and the entities that we're talking about are avoiding them. And that is the biggest challenge that we all face. And I'll stop there because we'll pick up on how to respond to that in the discussions about the next two questions. Thank you, Anselmo, and everyone else.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. You point out the question of the effectiveness because G7, all those geopolitical bodies, not only the lacking legitimacy and also effectiveness. These are the double challenges we need to face. Thank you for reminding us of those challenges. Let's go to the last but not least, Dorothy Guerrero. She has a very interesting experience. As you see in her bio, she is a truly global. From Philippines, and now the UK. At the same time, she's worked on China and South Africa. She's the right person to talk about this. That's why I put her the last speaker, because she's the one who embraced all these components. Dorothy, you have the floor, please.
Okay, thank you, Anselmo. And I hope I am heard clearly and that I don't have a problem with the reception because there's construction going on in the house. Well, I think I would echo what all the speakers before me mentioned, that we are addressing and we are concerned with all these multilateral formations. But at the same time, we very well know, one, the G7 created the problems that they're claiming to solve, and that both G20 and the BRICS have yet to prove that they could offer alternatives. And at the same time, all of them as a formation, or also the countries within them, are also supporting the global rules on trade, finance, investments that are reinforcing unequal relations that are replicating and enhancing the diverse asymmetries between different actors in different scales, corresponding to the most diverse patterns of domination that traverses class, race, gender, coloniality, societal nature relations, and all these patterns of domination. The global rules on trade, finance, investments are not neutral, or even per se, trade, finance, investment are not neutral. They are tools for domination, and the most visible result of that is a growing debt of the South, which leads to more economic subordination. So all these formations are supporters, and also they wanted to entrench further those powers that are entrenched on finance, trade, and investment rules. And we have seen that the processes or their meetings fail, although it's not something that have teeth. Actually, it's a talk shop. But then they enhance, they shape policies. But at the same time, even as talk shops, they also fail in addressing key important or key problems of the time. Like we could look back when the UK hosted the G7 summit, it was the height of the pandemic, and they were not able to offer alternatives. And also they even failed to address COVID-19 pandemic in an equitable manner. They just let the big pharmaceutical corporations decide and continue to decide who lives and dies. And that leads to the second point. Many of us here in this discussion, in this forum, spent many years of our lives fighting neoliberal capitalism. But in recent years, we have seen the rise of monopoly capitalism. So Sharmali talked about those oligarchs. The basic needs that we need for living, food, health services, energy, transportation, communication, even data about ourselves, are now increasingly controlled by very few corporations. And all these formations and individual countries within it are not challenging or incapable of challenging that kind of power. And I'm not just talking here about adjectives. I'm talking here also about the noun, because we still need to expose that all the countries are still following the model that has failing us again and again, and they are not questioning it. The war, on the issue of the war in Europe brought about by Russia's occupation of Ukraine, this actually lifted the neoliberal myth about the durability of the global order. Only these powers believe that there is a durability of global order. However, the challenge now that that myth has been lifted, or that veil has been lifted, is that how can we highlight the impacts of that war with issues of climate, death, and other economic justice concerns? Even if it ends tomorrow, then Ukraine will be faced with more deaths. Ukraine will be faced with a devastated environment. And of course, war, all those bombings and all those missiles have impacts on the climate. So what is interesting in the last few, maybe couple of weeks, is that even the Fridays for Future Youth Group also address the problem of NATO. So of course, we have to point out that Russia's occupation of Ukraine started it all, but at the same time, we should not let NATO get away with its role as well. I also agree with what Farouk and the others, Andy, mentioned, that fascism reappeared globally. Elected and unelected authoritarian leaders are changing the rules to diminish the hard-fought victories and rights won by generations of activists and movements. They're just demolishing them all. Sadly, there will be a US, UK, and EU elections next year, and the results may be a backlash from the mistakes and failures in addressing poverty, inequality, and injustices. Here in the UK, maybe the Tories will be voted out, but at the same time, we still need to do a lot to make the Labour's stance and also the policies that they will put in place to be more progressive, to be more addressing the needs of people. Otherwise, there will be a backlash as well, and the more conservative, the more far right bloc will win, and they're already regrouping. We could also see them reorganizing for a comeback. They still haven't left, but they're already organizing for the comeback. At the same time, both the US and the UK approach in the national elections in 2024 are very inward looking. The prospect of politics, this prospect of politics may further erode the so-called values that they wanted to say they represent or promote. And this could actually, this kind of change can also shape the politics to one. And I could only hope that Trump will go to jail before he gets reelected. But there is many Americans are saying they are really fearful that Trump may return. On the debt issue, 14 out of 21 developing countries are facing debt default. But then also the question on the South, since I'm still wearing my Southern hat, there's much talk about emerging countries in great power competition. But are they actually leading or seen as leaders by fellow developing countries? Even when we talk about the non-aligned movement of the past that our people have nostalgia about, and we do want them to have more influence or more say in global meetings and relations like G7 and G20 and BRICS, but it's a mixed bag of interests. And they do not actually align those interests. That's a problem. So given that, how effective can they be? Also on the much talk about plurilateralism, shared interest. But what are the shared interests? So those are the questions. Also the fact that we could not actually ratchet up things or bad things about China too much. Because like, for example, on climate, today's news in the Guardian shows that China is actually achieving its target on renewable energy use 5 years earlier than the target of 2020. In fact, if you put all together the renewable energy projects globally, China's renewable energy project will still be bigger. So that's just a thing that I wanted to say on China and energy and climate, wherein I will segue to my main point. The big narrative that social movements won in the last, after 3 decades of denialism by corporations and governments, is that there is now a global consensus that the climate change is a global issue that needs global cooperation and solidarity. There's now a growing consensus as well that to address climate change, we need to leave fossil fuels on the ground, and we need a swift or immediate transition to renewable energy and eventual phase out of fossil fuels. But the question is, who will start first? Who will do it first? Who has the energy and capacity to do that? Even in terms of those capacity, when we talk about technologies, all those technologies are also controlled by transnational corporations. So who could force them to give or share those technologies to the developing countries? When in fact, even in the United Framework Convention on Climate Change, what they show is a history of refusal to actually do a commensurate climate action to the challenges at the time. They have been blocking, they have been delaying, they have been denying their responsibility on climate finance and technology transfer, and what they're promoting all these false solutions that will make corporations earn more. And the last issue that I will point out as well is that in the question of transition, we also have to take into consideration that in the rush for renewable energy, which is important, what we're also seeing are the creation of new areas of inequality, new areas of sacrifice in terms of they are the sources of critical minerals, because we can't talk about renewable energy without those critical minerals. And again, the world is being reshaped, and also there's a new carving of the world depending on where those critical minerals are found at. And it's not enough, even if there are countries that are saying we are willing to share these critical minerals, but at the right price. But then how many countries are strong like that to say and also to force a more equitable trade on those critical minerals? What we are fearful of is that those mining will continue. So that's also another, we mentioned before that energy transition and climate change are both sides of the same coin, but also renewable energy and transition is at the same side of the coin as well, because we should not create new inequality, new destructive extractivism in the search and extraction of these critical minerals. I think I will stop there, and then I will say more when it comes to the challenges, because at the moment the government initiatives are not commensurate to the challenge at the time, and at the same time all the civil society social movement initiatives are also not strong and big enough. So that's a big challenge that we're all facing.
Okay, thank you very much, Dorothy. You're touching upon various issues, especially your expertise on China. Your perspective is very much appreciated. You know, these days a lot of demonizing China. Everything is about China, but I think we need to have a really balanced, more realistic perspective based on what's really happening and in China and so on. Okay, so with this one, this is the first round of the interventions about challenges, but some of you already addressed the question number 2 and 3, but nevertheless, let's go to but because of the time constraint, I'd like to ask all the panelists to address both question number 2 and 3. 2 is a challenge about CSO engagement. As you know, we have a C7 and C20. Now we have a People's 20, but we also have the People's Forum on BRICS. Not regular, but the on and off. That's why we need to assess what are the challenges to CSO engagement. Was it effective and strategic enough? And how can you do, more effectively engage those geopolitical summits? Because this is co-hosted by the Asia-Europe People's Forum. As you know, ASEM, but ASEM is not really functioning once every 2 years. So ASEM is a geopolitical plus geographical. But now many of the ASEM members, they are either BRICS or G7 or G20. So it's very complex, you know. So let's go our second round. The first speaker will be the Sandra, because she has another appointment. Sandra, you'll be the first one to answer this question number 2 and 3, especially UK and then G7 point of view, please.
Yeah, I'll be quick, as I will need to also unfortunately leave the call very soon. So I already kind of noted about the engagement. So I think, yes, the challenges is the capacity, and I would say also a bit of fragmentation. And maybe just now I'll focus a little bit more on the kind of the, you know, solutions potentially. Being part of the C7, you know, steering committee and the C7 process the last few years, I think there's definitely maybe ways to explore how we can actually work together and not necessarily have these, you know, lines, you know, between C7, C20 breaks, but then there's also kind of the other engagements as well, more kind of UN space as well. So I think there's lots of bubbles, you know, and I think it's not helpful because actually, you know, from one summit to another summit, actually it's all are joined up, right? And I think the argument also, which I fully support as well, you know, that we shouldn't reinforce these informal spaces, you know, for decision making, which affects everyone, but rather, you know, that these are the spaces, you know, where we ask for progress in these official multilateral spaces from these members of this, you know, like G7, G20 and all that. So, linking up more with the civil society, you know, any kind of engagement groups is in the UN forum as well, I think would be really, really useful. So looking at kind of coordination as a civil society. And that leads also to my next point really about, I think, how we can really also, you know, coordinate better on the actually the substance, you know, because you know, even what we had just talked about the climate change, you know, and there's no consensus, and we are actually going out with different messages, and I think that also can be used against us as against our agenda, you know, really then kind of. In many ways also often legitimizing doing something, you know, because, you know, kind of civil society is asking, but that's not necessarily reflecting also. I think something to do with really spending also more time to, especially where we have these diverse views, you know, to really, you know, face that, you know, and not rather than separate in separate kind of spaces, you know, and also just maybe it's definitely G7 space, but maybe that applies also to, for example, G20. What I sense is also, I think we need to work in a more consistent way, also with other engagement groups. W7, L7, you know, Y7 are, I think, our closest, you know, allies, possibly also more. I mean, they're in C7 space, there are lots of other these groups. And again, you know, the more aligned we are with other engagement groups, at least on key critical things, that means that we'll be more likely actually really can make the point and can get some wins. Because again, on the other end, you know, they end up having so many diverse views, which again is just not helpful really for pushing things through. So, and I know that our Japanese colleagues, you know, have been really being really good this year and still keep doing. We have signed so many, you know, joint statements and all that, which I think we just need to keep doing actually more, so to bring that kind of more coherent language and ask and mobilize more diverse kind of civil society around issues we care. So I'll stop here, and really thanks for the invitation, as I will be really, yeah, I'll need to leave now. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. The 3 other points, one is a capacity, second coordination, and third one is a substantive coordination, especially with the other engagement group. For those who are not familiar with the system, G7 has a 7 official engagement group, women, youth, labor, and so on. And so G20 has an 11 engagement group. The civil society, one of them, but we have also like-minded group like a labor, youth, women. So how we work with those engagement group, or we like a major group and other stakeholders. So these are the 3 challenges identified by Sandra. Let's go to Sharmali. Could you please share your perspective on the challenges and then the strategies? Sharmali, please.
Oh, yeah. Can you see me okay? Yes.
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Thank you. You know, I don't want to make a critical assessment of how civil society has engaged with these platforms, because I think groups engage in whatever ways they can when they can. But what I've noticed is that we as civil society have not been able to have the positive impacts we may want in terms of changing policies and agendas. And I think the reasons for that is that the spaces for civil society engagement are so carefully circumscribed by the governments themselves, by these formations, no? So we are engaging on the rules not set by us. We're engaging on the rules set by these formations and by the host government. So they're not our rules, you know, and we can't step outside of it. And so depending on the political atmosphere and the level of repression of freedom in that particular country, like, you know, look at India, the press is heavily censored, civil society faces the threats of political reprisals and repercussions if we, you know, criticize the government. Doesn't matter that our prime minister or anybody says we're the biggest democracy in the world. What's happening in India now is a complete travesty of democracy, you know? So engagement and advocacy is going to be limited because of these two challenges. You know, one is that the rules of engagement are not set by civil society and social movements and unions. And secondly, we have to be very careful of reprisals and political repercussions, no? So that said, I mean, okay, in terms of strategies, of course, we need to work on strategies together on debt, climate, global tax reforms, on addressing trade and investment issues, addressing the political economy of financialization, and so on. So it's very clear that we all need to put our we need to pool our forces. We can't work in silos, no? So we need to work across platforms, across, you know, across sectors and issues, and of course, North-South regions. No argument. I think it's very important because of the not just the multiple layered crisis that we're facing, but the recurrence of these crises again and again. And also this very dangerous shift in governance, where corporations and the wealthy and the elites and the colonial powers who have created the problems now pretend that they have the answers. No? But just a few other more strategic points to add here. I think one of the things we need to do across countries is to find ways to overcome political repression and threats. How we do that is a challenge itself, you know. How can we across different countries come together to fight political repression and threats and protect each other? So that's one question for discussion. I don't have an answer for it, but then. Another thing I would say is on the issue of multilateralism. I think we need to defend multilateralism from neoliberalism and from corporate capture. And we need to rebuild multilateralism in such a way where government representatives in these spaces take their direction from national democratic processes and they are answerable to people directly. Because what's happening is that our governments are going to multilateral spaces and they're also going to G7, G20, this, whatever. And they are saying, doing whatever they've decided they want to do. And that agenda is not being set by the people of the country. That agenda is being set by the wealthy, by the elite, by corporations, and by capital. So I think but in order to be able to make them, how do I say, to work towards democratic multilateralism, to change multilateralism even at an international sphere, we need to move our own national democratic processes away from majoritarianism. Right now, we're really struggling under majoritarianism pervading as democracy, you know, especially in our sort of authoritarian, sort of fascist regimes. So we need democratic processes have to protect the interests of everyone, not the majorities, especially those who have been marginalized and rendered vulnerable. This is very important, I think. And then another very important cluster of issues for strategy is the issue of rights, collective and human. And I think if we actually look, I mean, many speakers have already pointed this out. I think I also said it earlier, and I echo this, you know, hard-won rights came from people's struggles are being rescinded, you know, nationally, internationally, regionally, no? And governments and corporations are actually stepping in and claiming rights for themselves, you know, because they want their gains. And if we look at what kinds of rights have actually been protected legally in the last several years, it's intellectual property rights, and which allows corporations to be able to secure market power, monopolies and oligopolies, you know, and basically ride roughshod over public interest. And the other kind of rights that have been secured legally are those of investor state, which comes through investor state dispute settlement mechanisms, which are there in all trade and investment agreements. No? So investor rights, IPRs are protected, but the rights of women, the rights of gender diverse people, the rights of the environment, the rights of workers, the rights of farmers, peasants, gone. None of them are there. So we need to rethink how we're going to work on this rights issue. You know, Volker Turk, the current Human Rights Commissioner, has said that what he's asking the world for a human rights economy in which the aim of advancing human rights informs all national economic, fiscal, monetary, investment, and business decisions. And this is something which I think we can try and work with, because, you know, we need to make sure that the economy and finance is embedded under social control. We go back to, you know, Karl Polanyi's old argument that when you disembed the finance, I mean, the economy from social and societal control, can be extremely dangerous to, you know, the common and the public interest. And I think if we're going to do that, if we want to demand and if we want to work together to coordinate, to say that global governance should be firmly embedded in a robust international human rights and a public interest network, that means we have to also work very hard on dismantling some structures, you know, dismantling the systems of intellectual property rights protection, dismantling ISDS, dismantling certain types of trade and investment agreements, you know, and all other economic agreements that allow corporations to concentrate market power and, you know, build monopolies and so on. We need to regain control of the economy. And I think this is something that civil society can, and social movements and unions, this is something we can do because we are the people. We are the people of the United States and nations, no? The governments are the representatives, but I think we have to reclaim and re-strategize this. And the last thing I just want to say is I would really put this, I'm putting this out there for debate. We need to rethink the idea of citizenship. The whole concept of citizenship has become a weapon in the hands of fascist and extreme authoritarian regimes. It's being used to deny millions of people their rights and dignity, and even recognition that they're human. You know, whether it's migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, indigenous people, religious, cultural minorities, and so citizenship has become a sort of it's really become a very double-edged sword. So, you know, given that we are trying to come together to deal with all these different fora together, this is something I'd like to put as a strategic point. And I stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sharmali, for very comprehensive information. I think you touch upon very, for me, it's 5 important components. One is the issue of co-optation, the rule of engagement. Although C7 and C20 is an institutionalization of the civil society engagement, but there are a lot of limitations because it was the government decision to decide on the rule of engagement for civil society, and important civic space, and also democratic multilateralism, social control, and also the citizenship and human rights. Thank you very much for your valuable input. Let's continue now. The Masaki Inaba, please.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. From my view, I have been working for the on the G7 advocacy this year, and so that somewhat a little more practical analysis I would like to give. So currently G7 has been losing its grips on the world. I have been observing G7 policy on pandemic preparedness. They made many ambiguous pledges on these issues, but actually most of the issues are delivered to G20 financial and health ministers meeting, G20 financial track, and the WHO multilateral policy development arena, such as pandemic treaty negotiations. It shows that G7 decisions are not the loose of the world. G20 financial track is the most important. The track has already led the establishment of the pandemic fund in 2022. On the context of the COVID-19, African Union gained significant influences headed by its vaccine envoy Strive Masiva and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. And TRIPS waiver was not realized, but the technology transfer, technology sharing, and the regional development of manufacturing capacity of medical countermeasures became the global agenda that even G7 expressed its commitment. Thanks to the efforts of the African Union, it shows the transition of the decision-making power in the world from G7 to G20 and the rest of the world. As I told you, the G7 has lost its grip on the world, has becoming a global north boot camp for G20 and global policy development arena. When we see the tendency, we need to be more strategically approach the G20 and its financial track. It is independent from G20 Sherpa track and separated from the politics of the hosting countries of the G20. In this context, G7 should be more aligned and strengthen its consolidation with civil society advocacy on G20 in not only general advocacy and social movement, but also specific issue-based advocacy such as global health. At the same time, civil society advocacy on G20 and global civil society should work more closely with Civil 7 on R&D of pandemic medical countermeasures. And G7 has the top-level capacity. The 100 days mission is to strengthen the network of surveillance, R&D, clinical trials, and the regulations among G7 and monopolize this capacity of G7. Fortunately or unfortunately, G7 splits on this mission between UK, US, and EU, but anyway, civil society of the world shouldn't ignore this G7-wide initiative and let G7 civil society work on it alone. Anyway, so solidarity together, and we can work together, to consolidate G7, C7 and C20 and global civil society movement, so that especially on the global health issues and specific advocacy issues, so that I would like to hope that the solidarity together. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Masaki. I want to also say once again, our CSO friends in Japan play a very important role. This year, the G7, G20 recently, I think they brought us together, not only among G7, G20 countries, non-G20 countries. I think this is important to continue, So the civil society, we are united beyond this G20 and G7 border, Okay, so let's continue. Now, Valeria and me, could you please share your perspective about challenges and strategies?
Thanks once again, Anselmo. Actually, I already mentioned main challenges, especially the fact that civic space is shrinking, increasingly shrinking. And we are aware of the fact that the world we need is a world where all people have the right and the real possibility to actively participate in shaping their lives and contribute to well-being for them and their communities. So we need to ensure that our global advocacy activities are firmly rooted in the needs of civil society in the country and the most vulnerable communities. And critical mass is needed to respond to the fragmentation of the world, and also for us to become an active player in a process of change. So I'd like to emphasize the fact that exactly Civil 7, Civil 20 as official engagements group of this informal fora go far beyond actually the 7 and 20 countries. For instance, this year within the Civil 7, we engaged with 700 organizations from more than 70 countries. For sure, we need to strengthen the relation between Civil 7 and Civil 20 engagements group with all of the other engagements group in a way to reinforce our messages, to make them consistent and coherent. So actually, leveraging on our locally and globally linked experience and expertise from different perspectives by joining forces globally and effectively collaborating, we are actually in a unique position to influence also G7, G20 and BRICS countries also within the G20 process. And especially, we need to hold them accountable for their commitment and demand for concrete actions to ensure spaces of democratic dialogue. And the last point I'd like to mention is the human rights ethical compass, that makes it possible to design and share policies and paths without anyone excluded. The framework of human rights is an ethical choice that makes us powerful thanks to the common responsibility. And under this framework of the human rights, with the determination to leave no one behind, we can boost and channel better our messages regarding the necessity, for instance, of a gender transformative approach, the need for a comprehensive vision and real sustainability, the policy coherence to link the future of the planet and humankind. We can ensure also that we can take care of vulnerabilities, we can protect diversities, ensuring the universal health coverage and promoting the different approaches, fostering meaningful environmental and energy policies to guide the just transition, to ensure, for instance, a human-centered use of new technology, including artificial intelligence in the workplaces, and just transition, which the CSOs consider as relevant to make sure that no one is left behind. So civil society is actually active in putting forward proposals based on human rights, and always suggesting alternative visions and concrete recommendations, is active and necessary to provide independent monitoring of the processes and upholding transparency in decision making. Civil society is active in denouncing abuses and crimes. So we can play, we have to play our role in order to contribute to improve the public decision-making process. And this is the bottom line I would like to share with you. Over.
Okay, thank you very much, Valeria. So we look forward to your leadership role in the coming years. Okay, let's continue. Now the Andy Lusford.
Thank you very much, Anselmo, and everyone else. In this vital area and how do we move forward, I'd just like to reinforce what Shalmani has said about we need to reclaim citizenship, would add active citizenship as something that's a fundamental way of taking forward both our human rights, our economic and social rights, but also our ability to have voice, influence and access in contributing to collaborative and deliberative processes, sometimes called democracy, in different ways. So I think as part of that process, we face some significant challenges at present, which are part of the challenges faced by CSO engagement with G7, BRICS, G20, and other institutions and entities such as ASEM, as Anselmo mentioned earlier. Whilst it's absolutely essential we continue, and everyone does, everyone that's been sharing their visions and aspirations today, we just have to continue to really strengthen those energies and that passion, that commitment. We have to recognize that one of the fundamental challenges we're in is growing authoritarianism, and that growing authoritarianism affects itself both at the local level, community level, the national level, and regional and the multilateral level. So there is a growing trend that in the institutions we're hoping to influence, there is an increasing tendencies of co-option of those spaces in some ways, the suffocation of those spaces in some places, the closing of those spaces in some places. And the result is that with decreasing or eroded accountability in some of these fora, is what has been shared by a number of people. We have these dislocated discourses coming out in the theatre of the communiques afterwards, which becomes very disorientating, very disturbing, and very challenging. Sounds all negative, doesn't it? Sorry about that. But how do we respond? And what the Asia-Europe People's Forum has worked through over a number of years on the assumption that ASEM was not a body that it was possible to constructively engage in and look for spaces to engage in, is to develop and strengthen the people's voice in itself for itself. And that is the lifeblood of the Asia-Europe People's Forum, which has evolved as, that we would say it ourselves, a very vibrant, inclusive, collaborative forum with limited institutionalization and significant flexibility and voice as a result. What we have done in what we believe and hope is an inclusive and collaborative way, not just within people actively involved in the AEPF, social movements, grassroots movements, CSOs and many others, but also with other organizations who are taking the lead on core issues and key issues. So this has expressed itself in our responses to the three fundamental challenges I shared earlier on. The first one was climate crisis and biodiversity loss. Response, climate justice and just transitions. Clear, we know that. Authoritarianism and discrimination. Our responses are resisting and condemning attempts to restrict freedom of expression, freedom of organize, freedom of association, and independent media. Another response, resisting and condemning attacks on the defenders of human rights, of trade unions, labor and peasant rights, and of course, women's rights and our environment. Next is exposing the captures, plural is vital, of state legal and political and administrative processes by corporate interests and authoritarian practices. And that includes some of the entities we're talking about. And then very importantly, linking people and groups who are being othered by the processes of discrimination and authoritarianism, and enabling the sharing of their experiences and responses. Mm-hmm. Thirdly, our challenge was the lack of social justice and growing inequalities. And the response, of course, is social justice for all, with key activities and campaigns on universal social protection, access to public health, housing, and of course, energy and education. So this is a lot, but how's it brought together? So we have worked exceedingly collaboratively and systematically and mutually respectfully to develop people's agenda for parliamentarians, which is a bringing together of this expression of people's visions for the more just, equal, inclusive, and environmentally respectful futures, and being able to express that directly with parliamentarians. Of course, we tend to collaborate more with progressive parliamentarians, but this is an agenda for all parliamentarians, and therefore is presented to ASEM, to the different entities that we would want to talk about. And also an enabling process called the People's Pledge. Actually, it's about looking to encourage and enable people to work collaboratively. And the pledge is around the common issues to enable us to bring together discourses and expressions of those wishes that we've shared earlier on under these common pledges. So I put in the chat links to the People's Agenda for Parliamentarians and also the People's Pledge. And I warmly and strongly welcome you to explore them and be part of them, or to incorporate them into your activities of social movements, grassroots organizations, and civil society organization, because that commonality of discourses is something which is absolutely fundamental. It's a voice and vehicle for our active citizenship, our collaboration around active citizenship, and it's a way of bringing together the whole expression of how we move forward in the context of the three questions that Anselmo has posed us today. With that, I'll close and wish us all enhanced energy and success in taking these visions forward.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy, for many important points, especially the emphasizing the collaboration with the parliament, which is becoming more and more important for democratic global governance and also within the country. Okay, now let's go to Dorothy. You have also a few minutes to share your perspective about challenges and strategies.
Yeah, and I will be very, very short this time. I think coming to look at all these formations as well, and also even the UN, we have to remind ourselves that, following dialectic, the multilateral bodies and processes are the sum of its components. So first and foremost, our task actually as citizens is also to ensure that we are strong, that local and national organizing and movement building to push for our government to be progressive is our task as well. Apart, of course, from engaging in all these processes. So we have to make sure that the policies and posturings of our own government and the global in the global processes could get aligned with what we wanted as people, as citizens, as movements. So we have to, I think, back to the basic, also focus on strengthening our movements, because that is very, very important. Of course, I now work in a campaign organization, but then at the same time, we make sure that we still keep our local groups. We still have our members, we have our movements, and I think that is important. And also we can learn from new movements as well. If we look at the example of XR, Extinction Rebellion, by their numbers, by their insistence, by their organizing, they forced the UK Parliament to recognize the climate crisis. And that recognition of the climate crisis have put in all these policy making in this global summit tree, the fact that there is a climate crisis. We could also look at the example of the People's Vaccine Alliance. They managed to push big leaders to see the importance of the TRIPS waiver. Now there is also a hub in South Africa that is doing reverse engineering of patented vaccine. And some of those, although it is not yet certain, some of those debates on the patents are getting into the new treaty on the new pandemics. And also we have to monitor that and keep looking at the result of the discussions, of the negotiations of those. We also have the example of the UN binding treaty on transnational corporations. It was a 4-year struggle before that was accepted as a UN treaty, and now we're monitoring it. So there are those examples wherein combination of campaign and social movements have pushed governments to listen and see what is essential and the commensurate response to the crisis. I think my second point will be on rebuilding internationalism. We've always say that the importance of global solidarity should be there in all our actions, especially now that we are facing a global authoritarianism. So the history of struggles that we learned from the emphasizing the solidarity to save ourselves and others, the rich practice of internationalism that sustained past battles against colonialism, slavery, fascism, dispossession, and war. They went through many debates and rethinking, but I think there are elements now that we can incorporate in our new ways of working globally and internationally. And my last point as well is on the issue of citizenship. We have also to stretch that and include the migrants in that aspect. We have seen how migrants were forced to leave the war-torn countries, the economically ravaged countries, and here in the UK, only to end up facing the cruelest laws and policies that are making sure that the migrants will not be comfortable, will not feel welcome in these countries. So I often mention in any global events I go to that yes, there's the peace movement, there's the feminist movement, there's the youth and the climate and the labor movement, and where are the migrant movements? So we should not leave the migrants on the migrant issue alone. They have to be incorporated in all these issues because first and foremost, it's a double jeopardy for them. They were pushed out of the country, and then at the same time they can't engage in the national level and global level discussions. So we need to put more linking of migrants in all these movements, in all these international summit pending that we are all doing. So I think that, and I will also not evaluate or see what we're doing in all these G7, G20 and BRICS processes. I think just to highlight, it's unfortunate that we were not able to get Patrick here. I saw the communications, but I think with the BRICS, the question there is that it is being held in countries where it's very difficult to organize. I think only South Africa, Brazil, and India, where there were people summit on the BRICS. And now that in August there's a prospect of expanding it, that Turkey, Egypt, the UAE, I think Argentina and others are planning to join. There's 10 or 11 countries that are joining. Will that also expand the democratic participation when they see that they are also expanding? But this is also showing a realignment of forces as well, which is significant to monitor. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dorothy. So putting all the important challenges we need to take into account. Okay, now sorry about the time management. I was listening to all the substantive input, but I was not able to control time. Sorry. I hope it's okay. So can we have 5 or 10 more minutes? If you are, because we have already still a few more speakers, Vidya, and also before we end, I want to invite the co-conveners to share their kind of the closing remark, Aoi and Ani. Before Vidya, I'd like to ask whether Kurt Frieder from Argentina, he's the only one from Latin America. As you know, this year we have G20 summit in India, but next year we go to Brazil, and then South Africa. So although we are a bit late, I'd like to hear the voice from the Kurt, Argentina, if you don't mind. Could you please share how you see the G20 process from Latin America briefly?
Hi, Anselmo, and thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this meeting. That's a very interesting meeting, and also to share a few words. As usual, it seems I'm the only one from this region of the world. Only 450 million people live here, and we are 33 countries. No, but it's like it goes. No. I have had the opportunity this year to being part of the G7, thanks to Masaki's invitation to be some kind of invitee for the Global South in the coordinating body of global health. And it was great really to be there and at least have my voice heard by some other people that usually don't hear people from the Global South. Besides that, I know next year G7 will be in Italy and G20 is going to be in Brazil. You are coming nearer to us. And so I hope to be much more active at that time than this year when it was, when it just started this People 20 movement. No? So, here I don't want to continue using, I know that we have to, after 2 hours, we have to close. So I thank you very much again. And please count on me and whatever I can do and how I can assist and continue working together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kurut, for your short intervention. Now the Vidya, as a panelist at the same time as a co-convener from India, could you please share your kind of wrap up and also concluding remarks?
Okay, thank you. So I think what we have to remember, because we are speaking in the context of the upcoming G20 summit and how India is, rolling out the red carpet for the world, and talking of what we are very unused to. They're talking not of rights-based stuff, but of service and Indian culture, and that's what they're showcasing. But what we must remember is that over the last couple of years, especially even before that, that the Indian government and corporates have weaponized much of the citizenry within India against civil society actors like myself and others in the room and beyond, so that we are seen as anti-national, as anti-Indian, as anti-development, as conspirators with the West who want to drag down India's position and reputation, etc. So really, we have become these problematic groups within India, and yet some of us have decided, let us try to hold ground. How has engagement until now, to answer your question, and Salmo, basically, I think all of us have been persevering across the board, because we want to challenge the status quo. We are not happy with how things are. We dream of a better, more just world, and therefore we've kept going. But when it comes to engagement with perhaps this G7, the G20, and the BRICS that we're talking about today, what have CSOs done? We've mostly collaborated to produce diverse documents, also reports, responses, statements that go out that we think can make the powerful, the rich, who are sitting at the table, think about the issues of the people. We are thinking that we are amplifying the voices from the ground so that policy makers actually make some change. But what we have actually noticed is that nothing much has changed. However progressive and radical, like we from the People's 20 this year are saying, okay, as the Civil 20, we know that there is some kind of alignment with the government of the day, and therefore you cannot be overly radical in your priority asks. But as the People's 20, we are saying we can be more progressive, we can be more radical, we can hit hard and ask tough questions and push the envelope, is what we're saying. But have we really fashioned the People's 20 on the G20? Are we so naive to think that the G20 is going to listen to us? I don't think we are. I don't think we think that the rich club is actually going to listen to us. But I think it is very important, and those of us in Indian civil society who felt we needed to do this, and remember there were many in Indian civil society who said, we cannot afford to do this. Our foreign contribution regulation account will be barred by the government. We will, the government will come down heavily on us, they will hound us, and so we cannot be with you in this endeavor. Some of us have stuck our necks out and said, we will do this. And we look at HLPF and other groups like this. Your solidarity is really important because it is a protective shield for us, those of us in India who are stepping up to hold ground. What we are also doing is we are protecting civic space as we know it, trying to expand it, because all around the ever widening sphere is of civic space shrinking so rapidly, and excesses and atrocities growing so much. So we are hoping that this is an opportunity to reach out to others, to be heard, to be understood, to come together in solidarity. I think it was Valerie who said the global north and the global south. We always use it very loosely. And I think Andy also said something that resonated. Democratic dialogue, not just in these spaces, but even within us, within the global north and south. So we are looking at expanding. Thank you, Andy, for the pledge of the AEPF. Also, the parliamentarian work that we need to do is so important. But really, for example, we are inviting all of you to come on 27th and 28th of next month, July, to what we're calling the People's 20 Assembly, that we are organizing in the Constitution Club in New Delhi. And everywhere people are telling us, don't announce the actual spot just now, because the Constitution Club can only be booked if you have a member of parliament's letter. And we have that, and we have booked Constitution Club, hoping that all of you will join us. But everyone's telling us, if the government comes to know in advance, they'll see that it's cancelled. So whatever it is, whether we can do it at Constitution Club or somewhere else, I invite all of you to show your solidarity and your resolve with civil society in the global south that has come together very decisively to say that we are the people, we want to be heard, we want to be understood. We know you do not want to engage. You set up your own, you cherry-picked your own organizations that are aligned with your right-wing mentality or ideology. And you've made them the new civil society. You've ignored autonomous civil society in India that has been so robust until now. But we will tell you that we are here, we're going to fight, we're going to build solidarities across networks, and we invite the AEPF and other groups to please be with us. And as Anselmo mentioned, the People's 20 will not end with the G20 on 9th and 10th of September. Yes, our campaigns have been old, continuing on those fundamental challenges that Andy again reminded us of. Everybody, I think we're very aligned into what are the important asks of people and planet. So the asks are there. We have been fighting until now. We'll fight in 2023 and onwards. The WSF will be one way, other fora will be other ways. I remember BRICS, People's BRICS in Goa in 2016 that we were very actively engaged with. And I think those of us, Annie and myself as conveners here on the ground in India, want it to be a successful people's movement and people's moment. That can only happen if all of you are with us. And therefore, we will have all the paperwork, we will have the documents, the policy pack, the important asks, the priority recommendations for the G20. But really, it's a coming together. It's another space that we want to hold. Thank you. Anselmo, have we muted you effectively?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Thank you very much for your very good articulation about the challenges. At the same time, the ground, the context. As you rightly pointed out, the G20 summit is a big challenge for civic space, but both in India at the same time, international civic space, I think that's why, as you stress very much, we need international solidarity for India at the same time for global civil society, So I think the People's 20 was born out of that context. And also already the AEPF, like a predecessor, So we need to work with those who have a previous engagement in the other intergovernmental forum and beyond, So let's continue to build our solidarity. Now, before we end, let me ask Aoi. I know Aoi, the Japan is a midnight, sorry. So very late, but I'd like to hear from Aoi because he has C7 and C20, now People 20. So he has a very unique position to understand all different dynamics. Could you please share your perspective briefly before we invite Annie to give us a concluding remarks? Aoi, you have a few minutes, please.
Thanks, Anselmo. But I'd like to be quite short because, as you said, here in Japan it's almost over midnight, and I think all the speakers,
But you are
pointed
ever
out,
vigilant.
yeah,
so no
various
problem.
topics, and especially Vidya, I don't have anything to add after your long speech. So I just very brief how we should move on towards G20 this year, BRICS summit for next year, G7 and G20. Because everyone have listened to the famous words that not everyone is safe, not everyone safe until everyone is safe, or not all the people are safe until everyone is safe. This is a famous word that was said during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we also know the slogan that nothing about us, nothing without us. So the civil society's role is that, of course, holding the government accountable, putting various issues, various perspectives in the official summit like G7, G20, but also we need to take care of the people, the voiceless people who might not be represented, who might not be heard. Of course, we say that leave no one behind is quite important, but for example, look at this webinar. We cannot invite more than 100 or 200 people, especially from the global south or the marginalized groups. And that's a civil society's role, that how we can bring our voices or listen to them for those who are not able to attend this meeting. So that was what this year C7 was keen, how to bring the voices, especially from the global south. So in continuing the advocacy towards G7 and G20, we continuously be collaborated with other marginalized groups or people with less privileged positions, so that at least we can have better coordinations, have a better collaborations within civil society or within the grassroots communities. And this is actually coming from my personal experiences for the G7 activity this year. Although Japan is considered to be a part of G7 or developed countries, there are a lot of people in Japan who have no access to higher educations, to have a higher health, treatment. And so for those who are not part of the C7 or who are not part of civil society movement, who are actually left behind. So the challenge is for us also is that how we can bring those voices in front of the G7 leaders or G20 leaders. So this is actually constantly challenged from the realities on the ground. And I think during our activities C7 this year, I met a lot of new people, a lot of new initiative or new organizations. We chat with each other, we discuss the chat strategies, and we make some friends. So of course, there are some negative issues, negative impact, as some of the presenters highlighted. But we can, of course, see some silver linings during our activities. So in conclusions, I'd like to welcome all of you to join the People's 20 movement this year or beyond. And I hope we can come up with concrete collaborative actions and policy recommendations together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Aoi. So now I'd like to invite Ani Namala, one of the co-conveners of People's 20, give us a kind of concluding remark as you welcome and opening remarks. Okay, please.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone who has really stayed through this long webinar, more than 2 hours, and particularly those who have passed midnight for, for continuing to be with us. So first of all, I think I would like to just thank everyone for this very enriching time. I think it has brought together diverse voices, diverse contexts, and most of all, I think all of us feel the urgent need to collaborate. I think that's been very evident in all the discussions. We do recognize the external threats. We do recognize the internal voices where we may not be coordinated in many ways. But I think civil society at country levels and global levels have shown the pathways for us to move forward in many ways. So I do not take this time to really sum up in any way, because I think the whole discussion has been so enriching and so full of strategies and way forward. I would only say that there is enough and more substantive issues for all of us to reclaim that space, reclaim that role that we, the people of the United Nations, we, the people in each of these countries that we have, called ourselves to. And I would just like to thank each one who's contributed to the thinking, shared their experiences. And when we were listening to actually the University of Toronto's, their, what do you say, they do a monitoring of the G20 and G70, G20 and the G7. And listening to them, it was so obvious that there is a gap in how people perceive G7 and G20 in those analysis. What is the reality of situations that are actually the reality, but it's almost like giving a tick mark to all the countries. So listening to them, it was very evident the need for a civil society analysis, the need for a civil society monitoring of these spaces and to come together at larger levels. I think we've made an initiative through the People's 20 because it goes beyond C20. It is not to a C20 process that we are talking. It goes beyond it, maybe an initiative, and hopefully we can take this forward with all the other collaborations to claim some of these, fundamental rights that we've always fought for, that we've always tried to invest in. Just want to say thank you to Anselmo also for really bringing all of us together and moderating this very important session. And I'm sure we will take a little while to read through the recording to pull down some of these strategies and recommendations. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. So now, before we end, so we have the solidarity ceremony. If you don't mind, you can open your camera, show your 3 fingers, the symbol against authoritarianism, to show our solidarity with the people who are struggling for democracy and human rights, particularly in Myanmar, and also who are fighting for peace in the Ukraine and Russia, all over the world, Okay, so let's take one photo. 1, 2, 3. Once again, 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you very much. So good night, Aoi, especially from Japan. Have a good sleep. Thank you for staying with us until midnight.
You
Okay,
too.
thank you. Have a good
Anselmo, you're in
day.
Bangkok. Okay.
I'm in Bangkok, sorry. Still 10 o'clock,
Thank you.
Okay.
And please
Okay.
consider being in Delhi in a month's time, 27th and 28th.
Please
of
mark
June.
your calendar. Hope to see you all in New Delhi.
Sure, sure.
If Indian government is
Waiting for your presence.
if Indian government is permit. If Indian government is permit.
Oh,
Please
India
get
is
a
a
tourist visa and just come.
It's a big question.
We'll try for that. We'll be trying for that.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Thank
Thank
you
you.
all.
Thank
See
you
you.
all so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. All the best.
Thank you. Bye bye.
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 Bye, Anis.
Bye.
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 Bye, everyone.
Oh.
So this recording just goes on the cloud, no, Vidya?
Yeah. You've chosen cloud, not computer,
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
Rajni?
Cloud. हाँ.
Then it'll.
रजनी जी हम पहली बार मिल रहे हैं शायद.
Acha, Rajni, Ashok, Rajni is part of the all women
Yeah.
team that heads Growth Watch.
Yes.
Our what do you call it? Lockdown baby, I like to call
Yeah.
it.
It's based at Bangalore or?
Yes,
Bangalore.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
I've heard a lot about you. Nice to meet you too.
Okay.
Bye, everyone. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.
Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night. Good night.
Bye, bye, bye.
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 Josie,
Bye.
Josie, you please remember the dates. You have to be in Delhi. I think Ayantika has spoken to you, right? Roy, you also. Roy,
Yes.
27, 28 July, Delhi. Ave.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, Vidyaji.
Oh,
Okay,
Roy David.
bye.
Roy David. Oh.
Roy
Bye-bye.
David. Good night. Good night.
Okay. Good night, Roy David. Good night.
Good night.
ഇന്റർനാഷണൽ മീറ്റിങ്ങുകൾ ഞാൻ കയറി വന്നാലും 25, 26, 27, 28 4 ദിവസം ഡൽഹി. ഇൻസാഫിന്റെ നാഷണൽ എക്സിക്യൂട്ടീവ്